I'm Sadie with Great Catholic Book Club, and this is a video of a speech that I gave on the Catholic imagination of Flannery O'Connor at the Iowa City Public Library on February 7th. So this is a few days after that, not too long of an upload to wait. First, this was the inaugural speech kicking off Great Catholic Book Club. So I got to talk about what we're doing here with this nonprofit, what we're all about, the things that I'm hoping that we can accomplish together. And this was the first time that I was able to do a speech putting something out there, engaging with the secular public. This wasn't an exclusively Catholic space. Of course, I love that. There's content that we'll be putting out, speeches that I'm going to present in churches, but it's the launch of something very important to me, which is going out there in the world and engaging with the public and being able to share Catholic topics and the Catholic worldview and Catholic culture and thought and perspective, particularly with an author like Flannery O'Connor, who is such an iconic Catholic author. So the things I got to talk about were really meaningful to me. First, I got to explain how the work of Flannery O'Connor, who was a Southern white woman growing up in Georgia, writing very Southern characters and stories that revolved around some Southern American culture, what she had in common with the immigrant experience. So for me, first generation American, daughter of Pakistani immigrants, how did this work speak to me? How was she so well able to illustrate that feeling of being a stranger in a strange land? And this is a topic of serious personal passion to me because reading classics of Western literature and American literature, for me, was fundamental to me feeling like I belong in this culture. You know, growing up I didn't speak English until I was in kindergarten, I think. So being immersed in a culture in your home life and then a completely different culture outside of your home life is quite the experience. And it was diving into Western literature that helped me start to understand what I thought was a very foreign culture and people and customs that I didn't understand. There was a water that everyone else in America seemed to swim in, a fundamentally like Christian Western perspective that I couldn't understand. And the arts and the literature helped me feel like I belong here, like this was my culture as well. I think it's so important to really analyze Western literature and Christian literature from a non-Western and a non-Christian perspective, because art can be a bridge that people from different cultures can cross in order to understand each other. And truly, my love for Western literature and Western art was the proto-evangelical basis for helping me understand the gospel. That's how I was able to eventually understand the gospel. So that's something really important to me. I didn't get to touch upon it quite to this depth in the speech because I still wanted to stay focused on Flannery O'Connor as opposed to Western or American literature as a whole. That'll have to be a future talk. I also got to talk about the Catholic doctrine of salvation and how it so uniquely explains the point of being alive and going through experiences over time and how it changes you and grows you and prepares you for union with the Lord, and how O'Connor's works really illustrate that. And then my favorite part was talking about why Catholics are so weird, why we love the bruised and bloody body of Christ so much, why we seem drawn to the gore and the suffering, and what the purpose of that is. And the idea that all human experience is so valuable and so beautiful, and there's nothing that isn't worthy of treasuring. And so I am really delighted with this speech and the things that I got to share and talk about. But most importantly, because I did this speech at a library, a good maybe half of the audience were people who came because this speech was at a public venue. And so getting to engage an audience that is not necessarily Catholic and getting to hear them express their opinions about the Catholic Church and the teachings of the Church, and getting to tackle sensitive subjects like we talked about racism and the art and the artist a lot. We got to talk about feminism and what Flannery O'Connor may or may not have thought of that. And these are topics and questions that I think a lot of people have. I know certainly before I came to the church, I had a lot of my ideas of what the church taught and my confusion as to how anyone could possibly believe those things or champion them. And so the fact that people were willing to be vulnerable, and openly and respectfully share where they were coming from and ask me these questions, I felt very honored that I got to be the person who was the face of the Catholic faith to them. And I've been praying that my words were full of wisdom and kindness and really can open the door to those good conversations. And I hope that they're able to continue. So my goal is to be able to continue offering these speeches on Catholic topics and the Catholic worldview in public venues so that we can continue having that kind of engagement. So without any further ado, here's my speech. Please enjoy. Okay, great. Well, first of all, welcome and thank you guys so much for coming on a Friday night to listen to a talk about Flannery O'Connor. I know that you must be big fans to do this. I'm Sadie Woodley. This talk on the Catholic imagination of Flannery O'Connor is put on behalf of the Great Catholic Book Club. That is my nonprofit. So I just want to take a few minutes to tell you about what we are doing with this nonprofit. We are participating in the new evangelization of the Catholic Church, which is about promoting engagement with the Catholic worldview and culture and thought through the areas of arts and education, support for marriage and family events. So we do the spiritual works of mercy through creating fellowship opportunities. Primarily, we have a book club that meets over Zoom every month, and we examine all kinds of art, all kinds of literature, and we do it through the Catholic philosophical lens. We are also doing speeches and presentations like this to engage with art through a Catholic lens, and hosting and creating spaces for art events for families, for young children, for all families in the Iowa City community. And we have a program to provide arts and educational resources for children in poverty. We have the Backpack for Kids program. We aim to provide fully stocked backpacks for children with all the school supplies that they need and some really great fiction books, particularly with a focus on migrant and refugee children that are being served through the Iowa Catholic Charities and children living in poverty in our local community. So this is affirmation of the Catholic principle that the education of children is all of our responsibility. In a society, it's a primary critical responsibility. So when you take the time to let a child know that their education really matters, regardless of the difficult or unstable circumstances they might be facing in their lives, that they have something real and valuable to offer to the world. Right? That their intellect, their point of view, their creative contribution to the world matters, right? And that they're worth investing in. And we're telling children that their thoughts and ideas can change the world, and that we want to help them do that. And that can be the difference for a lot of kids between life and death, right? To tell them that they are worthy of full human flourishing. I'm standing here tonight because this was done for me. People took the time to invest in my education and told me that the gifts that I have to offer to the world matter. And so it is a personal passion of mine to make sure that every child gets that message, most especially kids that don't have that opportunity in their day-to-day lives. We are here tonight to talk about the Catholic imagination of Flannery O'Connor. And that leads to a very obvious question. What is a Catholic imagination? And why do the works of Flannery O'Connor so beautifully exemplify this? So to answer, we are going to look at Flannery O'Connor's creative life in light of various saints and martyrs to understand a certain Catholic archetype of personality. And then we'll discuss the Tolkienian concept of subcreation. There are some of you who are familiar with Tolkien, another really fantastic favorite author of mine. And we'll talk about how Ms. O'Connor's characters demonstrate the Catholic philosophy of human beings participating with God in creating ourselves. And then lastly, we will look at the often disturbing nature of Flannery O'Connor's work in light of the Catholic embrace of the bruised and bloody body of Christ on the crucifix, and why as Catholics just like that suffering so much. So let's get into it. So we're looking at the person of Flannery O'Connor. Here is this young, very southern white woman who grew up in some rural areas, never married, never had a family, lived on a farm, raised peacocks for fun, and did oddly genteel things like see visitors after lunch as part of her daily routine. And I relate to her so much. Okay, so how does a Pakistani kid, living in Chicago with my immigrant Muslim family, growing up with all the noise and bustle of a big family. There were 0 farms and 0 plantations in my life growing up. I did not know anyone that raised peacocks. That was not a part of my day-to-day existence. I also didn't have callers visiting after luncheon on any given day. So what did I have in common with Flannery O'Connor? Well, she was pretty hardcore. So First, we have to consider that she grew up as a Catholic in the American South. Georgia is not exactly a bastion of Catholic population. Okay? So she was used to being different and kind of weird in her world. And this was at a time where differences in religious views could be just as alienating and ripe with grounds for maybe hostile interactions with people as perhaps political differences are today. It wasn't easy for her to exist as she was in that world. And the Catholic worldview in particular is so different, sometimes from sort of a mainstream Christianity in this country, that there were a lot of ways that she just was quite the odd duck, her and her family were. It's a fundamentally different concept of the self and of God, right? And so making oneself understood under those circumstances can be nearly impossible. And the pressure to abandon yourself and conform and assimilate to the culture around you is pretty high. So in many ways, Flannery O'Connor was just as acquainted with that feeling of being a stranger in a strange land as I was growing up in this country. Nevertheless, Flannery O'Connor did not assimilate. In fact, she doubled down, and she was an especially faithful Catholic throughout her short life. And towards the end, she was a daily Mass attendee, leading up to her death at the age of 39. Next, she was a Southerner, and by which I mean she was really, really Southern. Okay, so culture, mannerisms, worldview, her speech. In fact, when she first arrived in Iowa to possibly attend the Iowa Writers' Workshop, which she did end up attending and completing, she spoke to her professor, John Engel, at the Writers' Workshop, and he couldn't even understand what she was saying through her Georgian accent. She had to write it down and say, "My name is Flannery O'Connor. I am not a journalist. I would like to be a writer. May I please come in?" I've watched my Pakistani mother have to do that on occasion growing up. The accent is so thick, you just have to write it down because it's the only way anyone's going to be able to communicate with you. And in other ways, things today may not be as different as they should be from the 1940s, in the sense that Southern culture was not exactly associated with intellectual brilliance. There was a bias against Southern culture, that it couldn't necessarily produce anything of high intellectual value. So Ms. O'Connor labored under some negative stereotypes and questions about the cultural value of what she had to offer as a Southern author. And on top of all of this, she was a woman. Okay? She was a rather outspoken woman with a very high opinion of herself. And this was in contrast to sort of the demure solicitude that was expected of her at the time, and now as well. And once during a literary event when she was presenting as a guest lecturer, a student writer asked her why she decided to become a writer, and she straightforwardly replied, "Because I'm good at it." And you could hear a pin drop in the room after she said that. That was seen as rather unseemly. But to Flannery O'Connor, this wasn't arrogance. This was what humility really looked like. It's magnanimity, having an honest assessment of your strengths and skills. So she became a writer because she's good at it. That's the humble truth. And she was, right? So she was attempting to have a really, really bold voice. And she often made some very disturbing assessments about human nature. So all of these things made her different. Right? And she faced a lot of pressure to change herself to better conform to the world around her. And this is probably best illustrated in some of the difficulties that she faced during her publication process of her first novel, Wise Blood. So here's this young author. So she's formally very well educated. She has this lifetime of differentness hanging over her. Right? Maybe a little bit of a chip on her shoulder about wanting to prove herself. And some sense of a wariness of a pretty long life of being othered in every place that she went to, and also being seen as maybe lacking in some sophistication by people who themselves she felt lacked the intellect to recognize her brilliance. And the feedback that she got from her first publisher on the draft version of Wise Blood, the first 9 chapters that she sent, suggested that there might be some glaring deficiencies in her understanding and experiences that limited the value of the novel. So Ms. O'Connor immediately wrote to her agent and expressed some frustration, right, that she was being pressured to change her book into something more conventional. And that the publisher had spoken to her in a way that was what she considered kind of demeaning and condescending. Let's just use her own words to describe how she felt. The letter is addressed to a slightly dim-witted campfire girl, and I cannot look forward with composure to a lifetime of others like them. So she puts things very well. She did take a few deep breaths, and the next day wrote directly to the publisher and said, I feel that whatever virtues the novel may have are very much connected with the limitations you mention. I am not writing a conventional novel, and I think that the quality of the novel I write will derive precisely from the peculiarity or aloneness, if you will, of the experience I write from. In short, I am amenable to criticism, but only within the sphere of what I am trying to do. I will not pretend to do otherwise. The finished book, though I hope less angular, will be just as odd, if not odder, than the 9 chapters you now have. It's not the voice of a person who feels that she has to change herself to please other people, right? And a lot of young authors, okay, when they're given a chance to finally make a big break, they have a publishing deal, they tend to be a bit ducked under. The conventional wisdom would say you ought to be willing to swallow your pride a little bit, put in your time. Okay, maybe you don't get to do the art that you'd like to get to do, but when you get into the right position, eventually you will be able to make the art that you would like to make. But to do otherwise, to antagonize a person who's in a position of power, to insist on your own value and your own artistic vision despite your lack of experience, in many ways that would be seen as career suicide. Okay, so you would think that Ms. O'Connor would play nice or be willing to swallow some of that dismissiveness and tolerate it, tolerate the disrespect for her abilities in order to take advantage of the opportunity that she was given. And that was not true of Flannery O'Connor. So recalling one of her meetings, her in-person meetings with this unhappy publisher, later she wrote, he and I came to the conclusion that I was prematurely arrogant. I supplied him with the phrase. Sorry, I'm laughing because I've had interactions like this with people. And she thought that no one will understand my need to work this novel out in my own way. Okay, so her novel sat in editorial limbo for quite a while. In the meantime, she lost a fellowship, a Guggenheim fellowship that she'd been put up for, and was making $0 on her writing, and she still stuck to her guns and stayed true to herself as an artist. Eventually, after a while, she was able to obtain a release from this publisher. She moved herself to a new publisher who completely supported her vision, and the rest is history, right? Wise Blood is an incredibly successful novel. So it turned out well in the end, right? And O'Connor is this iconic author who is well known for her uncompromisingly unique voice. But in the pendency of the proceedings, okay, during those years of being othered, of being seen as different, of being hounded by these stereotypes about who she is, of having her talents dismissed, of having her work misunderstood, of being asked to change herself to be more acceptable to the world, she couldn't have known that's how things would turn out. She faced a lot of pressure to conform, right, and change her voice, and being perceived as arrogant and difficult and even foolishly certain of herself. And she withstood all of that. And that's very Catholic. Okay? One fundamental Catholic principle that all of her work embodies, that she as an author embodies, is conformity is not sanctity. Right? If the Lord has given you certain gifts and you have a certain vision and you have a unique voice and unique talents, the art that you create is not made for other people's comfort. Right? This is the particular message and the particular gift that you were given to put out in the world. But most importantly, she withstood this without disconnecting from the world of creating. Right? So she didn't cut off her colleagues. She didn't cut off her neighbors growing up. She didn't even cut off this publisher. Eventually, he cut her loose. She didn't leave her relationships, including with the publishing world. She stayed connected while insisting firmly on what her conscience told her to do. right? So she created her own sense of welcome in the world, even if the world wasn't cooperating, and she relied on that. So this idea that you can have really, really great conflicts with the other, whether it's another individual, whether it's another system, whether it's an organization or institution, and you can refuse to compromise your boundaries or compromise your conscience, but you can stay connected to that relationship, right, on healthy terms, and stick to it until the situation is transformed. You really have to do this on faith, because you don't know how it's going to turn out, right? But you have to believe that there is no need to compromise between honoring your own artistic vision and your own self while honoring the relationship. This is something, even if you can't see how that could work out, and you can't imagine how that could possibly work out, we live in a very zero-sum world. How do you stay true to yourself and honor the relationship, right? But to make the commitment to do so is fundamentally Catholic. She never rejected the world, even when it seemed to reject her, but she also never abandoned herself. So this mirrors a story, and a lot of saints I was going to talk about, but I will stick to Saint Padre Pio, who is a relatively new saint. So this is a priest who was persecuted and slandered by his own fellow priests in Italy in the 1940s and 50s. And the church hierarchy itself refused to believe that he experienced stigmata, refused to believe the mystical experiences that he had. There was even a lot, in his immediate superiors, there's a lot of jealousy of his popularity with the laity. People really liked Padre Pio and what he was doing. He had a beautiful presence about him. And so the church hierarchy actually forbade him from publicly celebrating Mass. They forbade him from hearing confessions. Eventually, he couldn't even communicate with his spiritual advisor, and he was essentially a prisoner of the church. And the temptation to just leave the church at this point must have been overwhelming. But likewise, the temptation to maybe recant his claims and say that the spiritual experiences that he had were a fraud. Either of those approaches would have been much easier than living for nearly a decade, essentially as a prisoner, not allowed to communicate with anybody. Either of those choices even sound logical when you think about it. That is, of course, according to the logic of the world, and not Catholic logic, which is, the idea that you can only be yourself and you can only do you, so to speak, if you strike out on your own, right? You have to leave the system, and then you can be free to be who you really are. Otherwise, you have to be crushed by it. You have to conform and you have to change yourself. There's no other option, right? Whereas Padre Pio, here he had overwhelming public approval for what he was doing. He had a lot of popularity. He could have turned himself into a god if he had wanted to. He could have struck out and become a spiritual guru on his own, maybe found his own denomination. And if he did that, he would have been proving that his own mystical experiences were a lie. So, I should probably say here, I'm not saying that Flannery O'Connor had some interest in becoming her own spiritual guru and leading a movement. But what I'm saying is she could have given in to the pressure to conform. She could have allowed herself to change and be a more conventional author. But that process of sticking around in that conflict and allowing that to flesh out your identity and really help refine and clarify what your values are and what you stand for. Okay, and her demonstration to continue working with this publisher, but without compromising herself in any way, who she became as an author would never have happened without that experience, right? She wouldn't have become Flannery O'Connor. There's this uncompromising, connected self that is created in the forge of those conflicts. And that is actually how we create ourselves, according to the Catholic imagination. That's how we become what God made us to be, through our own efforts, united with his grace. So that leads to the second point about the Catholic imagination, which is the concept of subcreation. So this is a concept, this is a word coined by J.R.R. Tolkien, and what it describes is that we participate with God, literally in creating ourselves as human beings, right? So we're half finished. When the Lord made us, he intentionally half-baked us. So if we all have that sense of being half-baked, good news, it's true. We finish the process of baking ourselves, right? And so here we're going to have to talk about some theology and various doctrines of salvation too, to understand this a little bit more. So what is salvation? Generally speaking, it's the idea of whether your eternal soul goes to heaven or hell. right? If we're making it a very simple idea of what salvation is. And there are a lot of complicated views. I don't mean to oversimplify, but I'm going to for the purpose of this talk. So are you going to spend eternity with God or not? Right? That's essentially the Christian doctrine of salvation. And what determines that outcome? So most people, kind of a cultural Christian, sort of mainstream Christian understanding about this matter is this spectrum on one hand of once saved, always saved. It's one and done, right? You just go into a room somewhere, or you stand in a big revival meeting somewhere, and you just say, Jesus, come into my heart, and it happens, and you accept the Lord, and now you're saved. One and done, there you go. Okay, and the other end of this spectrum is the doctrine of predestination, which is that God has his elect, and people who are destined to be saved and to be in heaven with him, that's already all sorted out. And there's nothing you can do. You don't really know in this life which basket you're going to fall into. Okay, so you're either in or you're out, but it's really not up to you in any way. These sound like two completely different views on salvation, but they're actually completely the same. Because they both essentially say that nothing you do in your life really matters. They're illogical in different ways. And they tell you that there's no real reason to go through life or to move through time, right? Either you're saved and it doesn't matter what you do after that point. You're ready, you're good, go off and be with God. Well, then why are you still alive? Why are we sticking around for all of this? Right? If you're already saved no matter what you do, and you can't control it either way, well, let's be done with this nonsense. This pain and understanding for no reason, right? And if you can't be saved no matter what you do, if you have no idea whether you're going to end up with God or not, well then too, why are we alive? Why didn't the Lord just create the people he wanted in the first place instead of a bunch of people he doesn't want? Seems like that makes you wonder about the kind of person the Lord is. So both of those views take the point of being alive completely out of the picture. So now we just juxtapose this with the Catholic doctrine of salvation, right? Is that heaven is a state of being in union with God, right? It's not just ending up in some really nice place, right, where all your wishes and dreams come true, but it's actually being in union, in perfect relationship with God. And God is perfect truth. So what it really means is this is about our relationship with the truth, right? And relationships like that, any relationship, but especially a relationship with the truth, is something that is cultivated over time. There's no other way to do it. Right? It can't be one and done. It has to be one and begun. We make a decision to enter into this relationship, and now we have a lifetime of deepening in it and growing in it. Right? So when we say the word salvation, we can replace it, everywhere we say salvation, we can replace it with relationship with the truth. Okay, and that fits really well. So again, it's the truth about who God is, it's the truth about who we are, it's the truth about the world at large, and like any relationship, again, it's perfected or not over time. Just like in a marriage, right? It's perfected or not over time. We learn to love over time. And so accepting this relationship, deciding to enter this relationship, is entirely dependent on our free will, right? But if we do, it's just the beginning of a journey of growth and refinement. What we do, the choices that we make, they matter very much afterwards, right? Because this is a path of progress, right? We are expected to change and mature and grow in this relationship. That is a growth towards holiness, right? That we become saints. And the definition of a saint is someone who has a perfect relationship with the truth, right? Perfect growth. And when we do that, when we have this perfect relationship with the truth, that is how we participate in becoming human beings. The more our relationship with the truth grows, the more human we become, right? As opposed to animals, which is a big theme in Flannery O'Connor's work. The human as the animal, or the human as the full human being. So, in that sense, you can lose your salvation, of course, by rejecting or turning away from the truth at any time, but you can always get it back. You can always get back into right relationship. right? So this is Catholic theology. You can always reconcile that relationship, but you can choose to walk away from it. The Lord doesn't walk away from us. We can choose to walk away. And every time we go back and we recommit to this relationship, the goal is that we can form a better and better relationship with the truth. We can learn who God is better and better. We can learn who we are better and better. And a fully alive, complete human being is one who has cooperated with that grace to, oh, forgive me for this words, achieve enlightenment. Okay, I'm sorry, the Buddhists put it really well. So for the sake of this conversation, we'll go ahead and stick with their terminology. But the point is that we all have this opportunity to flourish, right? To flourish into the fullness of what it means to be a human being, to achieve that perfect enlightenment. And that means that we can perfectly become who we are, who we're meant to be. We're half-baked, but we can finish baking ourselves with the Lord's cooperation and help, by cooperating with him. And then we have this perfect relationship with truth and goodness and beauty. And we can see and know the truth about ourselves and God if we want it. So Flannery O'Connor's work is just a beautiful example of how this works. In nearly every story, every character has an instance, maybe many instances, to decide whether to be human or not, right? To grow into their humanness or to reject it. So if we focus on her first work, The Geranium, and I'm going to say this right now, I very often in my head accidentally say the germanium. So if I say germanium, please forgive me. I mean the flower. So The Geranium starts with old Dudley, a character who has finally given up on the idea of living independently. As an old man, he has no choice but to go leave his little country neighborhood that he is very used to and very comfortable in and move to New York with his daughter so that she can take care of him. And he is remarkably unappreciative of her sacrifice and of her efforts towards his care. He's afraid. He recognizes nothing in this city. Nothing that makes him feel safe, comfortable, or secure is around him anymore. And he's overwhelmed. This is a man who grew up in the country and lived with very little stimulus for much of his life, except that which was extremely familiar. And he's suddenly in New York, and he's surrounded by experiences that he can barely handle. So his experiences in life are limited, but they're not limited just by his external circumstances, right? They are also limited by his own prejudices. And so he is in a position to have to confront his own racism. So when you have to choose between the comfort and security of your old beliefs or face this radical reorientation to something else, that is not easy to do. Okay, it's hard enough to do it under ideal circumstances, but to do so in old age when you've held on to those prejudices for quite a few decades, and you're doing it under such frightening circumstances where everything around you is so new, that's really hard. Right? And a lot of what Flannery O'Connor did in this book, it was meant to mirror her own struggle with her own sense of racist ideas and values that she held and had a lot of guilt about. So, she grew up thinking, I believe that every human being is a child of God. That's what my faith tells me. And yet my cultural values say that this particular subset of people, because of the color of their skin, are not worth as much as human beings. And a lot of her letters and a lot of her writings and a lot of her stories, she's clearly wrestling with these demons inside of herself and trying to understand, working out her own salvation, right? So how frightening and even pitiful, she creates this character where she just kind of imagines how awful it would be to be at the end of your life and realize that you didn't manage to outrun the things you need to confront. And what a sad situation you might be in. The things you don't want to wrestle with today, they'll catch up to you sometime. And it's awfully sad to be at the end of your life and realize that you didn't get away from having to wrestle with those things. Okay, so now old Dudley has to do it at an age where he doesn't have the same resources, doesn't have the same mental flexibility. This would have been far better to do as a child when he was younger. And, I have a quote I have a grizzled old buddy of mine that's been in AA for maybe 30 years now, and he has a quote that I really like. He says, that feeling of the ground constantly shifting under your feet, it doesn't go away. You just get used to it. So, Some of us are really successful for a long time in life at keeping the ground still and avoiding that feeling of it shifting under our feet, right? That it's our life work to make sure that we don't let that ground shift under our feet, no matter how small we have to make our world, right? And the geranium says that sooner or later, the terms of life are going to win. You can't stop that ground from shifting, right? And you have to face it. So in the story, old Dudley he ran down the stairs, is trying to come back up, and he falls down, and a black neighbor stops to help him. And he picks him up off the stairs, and he helps carry him back up to his apartment, and he is friendly, and he's kind, and he calls him an old timer, and he treats him with incredible empathy, maybe more empathy than anyone has treated him with in the city. And he treats him like an equal. And this leaves Dudley completely shaken. Okay? At the end of the story, as is true of nearly all of Flannery O'Connor's stories, we don't know what Dudley decides to do with this experience. We know the factors that are against him, right? He's very set in his ways. He's intentionally obtuse, intentionally ignorant. He's already overwhelmed with stress and fear. So we know that the odds are pretty stacked against him, but we don't really know what he's going to do, right? He still has a choice to become a human being or not. All of Flannery O'Connor's stories tend to end right where the characters have that open-ended grace, that chance to choose to become human or reject that grace. And they all seem to be running away from it at the end, right? Such as the end of the life you save may be your own. The one-armed drifter, towards the end of the story, after abandoning a young, mute, probably autistic girl that he was supposed to take charge of and care for, after abandoning her at a diner and driving away, at the end of the story, you see him sweating and furiously driving as far away as he could. Well, he could have turned around and repented. He clearly chose not to at the end of the story, but we don't really know. We don't really know what he does 5 minutes later, right? One thing is certain, though, at the end of every story, you have this really uneasy feeling that it would have been relatively easy for the character to have chosen sainthood. It really seems like it would have been easier than the misery with which some of these characters run away from grace. Okay, Graham Greene, another incredible Catholic author, at the end of The Power and the Glory, there's a character of an alcoholic priest who is being marched to his execution by the Mexican government during the persecution of the church in Mexico. Around this era, I believe it was the 1930s. Forgive me if my era is off. But this character notes that as he's marching towards his death, he realizes it would have been so easy to be a saint. A little more kind, a little more empathetic, a little more self-sacrificing, a little more considerate. It would have been so easy to have chosen to be a saint. And this is a hallmark of the Catholic imagination, right? It really is our choice to grow into our humanness, to choose God, to choose to become a saint. And ultimately, it's not a very complicated choice. In every single Flannery O'Connor story, that choice is pretty simple. Turn the car around. Let that kindness touch your heart. Accept the baby that you never wanted. It's not complicated to choose to become a saint. But let's be real, it's a long choice because it's not just one choice. One of the difficult aspects of being a human being and participating in creating ourselves over time is that you have to do it again and again and again. It's not like the Blessed Virgin Mary's fiat, where she said yes to God one time and now it's over. You have to do it every single day, sometimes dozens of times a day. So yes, it would be easy to become a saint, but you've got to choose to do it again and again. You have to commit to this. It's perseverance. But as arduous as this sounds, Flannery's work still shows us that it's much less exhausting than running from grace. You're going to be exhausted either way. You're going to wear yourself out running away from these opportunities to become a human being, Or you can give yourself up and pour yourself out like a libation, running towards becoming a human being. What do you choose? It's hard either way. There's no easy solution, but one might be the easier, softer way. So that gets us to the final topic of the Catholic imagination of Flannery O'Connor, which is why is her work so darn disturbing? It is so dark. It is so dark and grotesque and ugly, and the characters are animalistic, and she showcases such grimy evil. Okay, and really, I mean, child suicides, okay? A serial killer killing off a whole family from the baby to the grandma. These aren't pretty stories. And this is the Catholic obsession with the crucifix over the cross. Okay, again, it's the embrace of this bruised and bloody and broken body of Christ. It's not just an obsession with gore and suffering for its own sake, though. Okay, but it's a commitment. It's a commitment to responding with curiosity over fear. Okay, we can be, when we're facing the scary parts of life, we can decide that we're saved and now we're pure. And we ought to go live on top of that mountain and enjoy our enlightenment and not let anything contaminate it, right? That if we've gotten away from the difficult or painful moments in life, let's just take that and run. Okay? And I'm guilty of that myself nearly every day, right? But instead, the Catholic worldview says you need to get your hands dirty, okay, in the reality of the world. In the grime, in the pain. You have to meet the world in the midst of all of the pain and the suffering and the ugliness in it, and the reality of what us human beings are capable of. And when you do that, you are called to be a light in that suffering. Okay? And you're supposed to go into it with your love, including for the unlovable. You're supposed to go into it with your uncompromising commitment to the truth, and you're supposed to, with the strength of the Lord, not your own, you're supposed to transform all of that pain into fodder for personal spiritual growth. Your own primarily, hopefully the other person's, but there's a quote I like that God is much more concerned about making you a better person than he is in using you to make other people better people. So worry about yourself. Right? And it ties back into this Catholic conviction of staying connected. You don't let go of those relationships. Okay? The point of becoming holy is not to leave the ugliness of the world behind, to transcend above it and say that you're better than it, and go off and be with God and leave all of those suffering, terrible people to themselves. Right? That ugliness and that pain, you don't give up on it. You don't give up on the world. And you don't stop loving it. In fact, you learn to love it more. Exactly as it is. Salvation in this life is not about creating a world where the evils and the ugliness of life can no longer touch you. Okay? Rather, it's a joyful embrace of exactly the kind of stuff that you wish you never had to feel, that you wish you never had to experience. That pain and anxiety and grief and discomfort and horror that none of us wake up and eagerly wish to embrace on any given day. Right? But joyfully embracing that, right, and being grateful for those experiences is at the heart of Catholic philosophy, right? Because the only reason you can feel those things you don't want to feel is because you get to be a human being, right? You get to exist and you get to experience it. The angels did not get to know what it feels like to be a human being because they are not physical, material beings. Even God himself took on human flesh to get to experience being a human being. That includes the bad stuff, the really, really bad stuff. That includes the ugliness and the betrayal and all of the griminess. It's all part of the human experience. And there is no aspect of human life, there's no aspect of human experience that is only good for throwing away and saying that doesn't count. So all of that ugliness, right, that's often exactly where we find our richest opportunities to choose to be human beings. It's when we directly confront that pain and that ugliness that we get that chance to say, how are we going to respond to this? And with love, with enlightenment, allowing grace to really transform our hearts. Let this ugliness increase how much we can love people. Right? And in every single Flannery O'Connor story, that choice is there. Now, the characters almost invariably refuse it, or we're left in a state of unknowing, but probably pretty sure they're going to refuse it. And that should disturb us. That should disturb us because, I'm going to paraphrase one of her quotes, but she said, to the hard of hearing, you have to shout. And so her point was to show the critical role of grace, that critical role of choosing to love, of choosing to become human. That's the stuff of life. And her work, I haven't read any author that shows that more often. I read her stories and I'm just fully committed to trying to be a cheerful and loving and good person that day. That's a good author right there. Okay, so this talk has gone on, not too long. Oh my goodness, I'm usually very long-winded. Thank you guys, thank you for sticking with me so that I could get this done exactly when I wanted to. There are a few key takeaways before we end. We'll just wrap it up. So the Catholic imagination, going back to the point of it, right? It's a very powerful commitment to the truth, right? And the fullness of the self. Being completely uncompromising about who you are, the gifts that God gave you, uniquely gave to you and nobody else. You have a voice, you have an artistic, you have a creative output that only you could put into the world. And you don't compromise on that, mainly because that treasure doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the Lord. And it isn't up to you to mutilate it or to dim it, right? And you do this at the same time in a world that is constantly wanting to dim it and constantly wanting to shut it down, denigrate it, and see you abandon it. And somehow you have to take this uncompromising self and you have to take this relationship with the world that doesn't accept it. And you have to let those two things stand in tension together. And you don't let go of either of those things. The Catholic imagination is seeing salvation as a process rather than a one-time event. It's something that we human beings must participate in. We have to choose to become human beings. We have to choose to allow our experiences to grow us and make us become human. So it's the idea that we're not finished products, right? And we participate in this act of creation with everything that we do. And the Catholic imagination is the open-hearted embrace of every single aspect of the human experience, right? Including, especially the painful ones, the ones that involve suffering, the ones that involve ugliness, knowing that it's in fact all beautiful. God doesn't throw anything away. Or the Christian concept of original sin, he could have thrown us all away then. And he didn't. So Flannery O'Connor's works, again, are some of the finest examples of the Catholic imagination, and of not throwing anything away, but rather allowing it to be transformed and seeing the beauty in it. And it's weird, and it's haunting, and it's full of so many opportunities for transformation of the self. Every moment, right, ugly or otherwise, is ripe with the potential for people to become human beings. And I couldn't think of an author that I would more joyously choose to kick off the Great Catholic Book Club, our nonprofit. So thank you so much for coming to this talk. I really appreciate all of you being here. I hope you enjoyed. Please look up our book club, more information about what we do, what our nonprofit does. And thank you so much for coming. God bless all of you. Have a great evening. Any questions?
I read a story recently about St. Padre Pio appearing on a battlefield and telling a soldier to stop and not go forward, and saving the soldier's life because an explosion happened like 10 feet away from him. So how could he be essentially imprisoned if he was able to bilocate? How could he be imprisoned in the monastery?
Yeah, his spirit couldn't be imprisoned. Yeah, the body could be physically imprisoned. Well, even then it was self-imposed. He could have left the church. You know, he wasn't literally locked in either. He could have said, I give up on all of this. I'm apostatizing. I no longer wish to be a priest. The door was wide open for him to walk out at any time, but he stayed physically under the circumstances that the church wanted him to stay in. He agreed to their terms, but his spirit, there are so many stories of Padre Pio bilocating during that 10-year era, you know, showing up in World War II, like fighter jets, you know. I don't remember the exact details of that story, but yeah, showing up in jets, communicating with random people, you know, so his spirit was certainly not constrained in any way. And Padre Pio is, I don't remember when he was canonized, but pretty recently. That is quite a courageous tale of somebody standing up against institutional injustice without compromising, but also without losing his ability to love. So, go ahead.
Throughout her life, I know you said that she was a devout Catholic who went to Mass every day. How aligned do you think she was with the Catholic Church's positions on just everything?
On everything?
In general, like this, you know, not equal status of women and things like that. I mean,
to the best of my knowledge, now she was alive before Vatican II, which did change a lot of the direction, didn't change any of the fundamental dogma or positions of the church, but it changed the direction with which the church communicates. Let's say that's, I hope that that's an artful way of saying it. But she was a pre-Vatican II era Catholic, so that was a very closed off, very conservative church that was kind of more isolationist, more ivory tower, not so much willing to explain or defend or discuss its positions with the larger world. Mm-hmm. And so to the best of my knowledge, she was all in 100% mm-hmm. with everything the church taught. So that was her position then. And I'm not sure how much of her writing she really gets into it, like the specific positions of the church, but she was very committed to the intellectual ideals of the human person, which includes the fundamental dignity and value of all human beings, including women. You know, the church holds that the perfect human being, the greatest and most perfect masterpiece of God's creation, was Mary, a woman, mm-hmm. right? And so it would have been very interesting to have a conversation with her mm-hmm. about the church's positions. But to the best of my knowledge, she was very, very in line with everything.
I haven't read very many of Flannery O'Connor's works, and a lot of them have male protagonists that I have read. And the women are usually more beneficent creatures, but not necessarily the protagonist or whatever. So I just wondered what her take on feminism would be, or if she had one. I didn't pick up on it in my mostly back in college reading of her.
She didn't really, in that era especially that she was writing, the late 1940s, early 1950s. But I will say there are stories where the protagonist, the main character, is a woman, and it's invariably a terrible person with terrible values and attitudes. Most of her. And I think ultimately she was writing herself. So one of her most famous stories is Revelation, and the protagonist is a woman who is just scathingly racist and has very, very negative views towards people, towards all Black people, and towards white people she considers beneath her. And it's a very ugly character who really experiences like some deep humbling.
What was the story?
Revelation.
Revelation. Okay.
Yeah, and that's so I think a lot of times when she was writing female characters and male characters, she was working out her own sense of the wounds and the flaws that she wanted to be healed of. You know, the ways that she felt that she didn't attain the level of holiness that she wanted to achieve as far as how she treated other people and how she regarded other people. And as far as we know from her work, we don't know what she thought about things towards the end of her life, or right before she died. But that her main concern, I think, was ideas of personal salvation and personal holiness. So I would say that having a conversation with her about subjects like feminism or larger systemic issues would have been interesting, because from what I've seen, most of her work centered around the individual wrestling with how they regard other people. So I think that might have been what she would pivot the conversation to, is, she's much more concerned about how she treats people than how she's regarded or treated.
Yeah.
Which is good, because that actually helps with anxiety a lot too,
Yeah. Control what you can.
Yeah. Which is often our own actions and our own perceptions and attitudes towards others and towards ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you probably mentioned this before we came in the door, but Flannery O'Connor, she read a lot of Thomas Aquinas. She wrote in letters that she read Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia every night before bed, and referred to herself as a hillbilly Thomist. And one of the things that I personally wrestle with about that is, it seems like in her essays, she reveals that she wants all of her writing and her fiction to be theologically accurate. She considered part of the job of the writer in depicting the world and depicting, its truth in the language you were using, was not only, people behave this way, but also this is the theological truths behind everything. In her essay, The Nature and Aim of Fiction, she talks about the fiction writer's anagogical view, the view of greater spirituality. And I guess, I wonder how necessary you think theological accuracy is in fiction, just considering that, one of the books in the Great Catholic Book Club reading list is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and there's varying degrees of concern for theological accuracy in the world of literature that you enjoy. But here's one writer who seems very set on theological accuracy in her own work.
Saying hitchhikers is not theologically.
I think I'll just on this one. So I'm not going to make that claim.
Okay, so the theology of God, if I get back to the definitions of it, is understanding the mind of God, right? So the more we understand the mind of God, our perception of who God is, the more accurate that is, the closer of a relationship we have with the truth. And I think oftentimes it's more a matter of our aim rather than whether it actually meets the mark. If our goal is to know God better, our goal is to as accurately express what we know to be true about God and his creation and what we know to be about ourselves, that's about all you're going to do in this life. I don't think perfect self-knowledge, perfect self-awareness is possible in this life. Likewise, perfectly understanding God is also not possible in this life. But creating art where your goal is to accurately express the truth as well as you possibly can, my opinion is every artist is trying to do that. Every artist is trying to be as theologically accurate as they know how. Artists aren't trying to lie, about anything. They're not trying to lie about God. They're not trying to lie about the world, about what they think or what they feel. Now, some are going to get closer to that truth than others, right? And some are intentionally trying to say true things about God. But I think the idea of trying to be as theologically accurate as you can, to me, that's what makes art holy. Like, you're trying as much as you can to search for and express true things about God, which means you're trying to say true things about human nature, right? And those two things are going to go together. The picture you paint of human nature is going to be closer to the truth the more you're able to say true things about God. And I think that was her aim. I don't know if that's how she would express it. And I know that she had some stronger opinions about the directions that other authors took with their work. But I think at its most base foundation, the purpose of all art, why does anybody try to create art, right? Why does a 5-year-old try to draw a picture? Why did I try to write fiction as a 12-year-old? I'm trying to say something real, right? We're trying to say something real about how we feel, what we think of the world, and what we think of God. And it should be our aim to refine that, to make that as close to what's actually true as possible. We should be aiming for theological truth. But a lot of times we don't intentionally know that's an option. We don't know that's what we're doing. Now, she was only 39 when she died. So pretty early on in life, she understood that this was the aim of her art, that she wanted to say true things about God. And who knows how much closer she would have gotten as she kept writing. I think that would have been incredible to see. But I know that I'm really drawn to work that's trying to do that. But the books on the list, especially The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I think that's exactly what Douglas Adams is trying to do in his own way. He's trying to say something true, which is, it pretty much boils down to a sense of confusion and frustration that truth cannot be found, right? Like, you can't possibly understand God, makes no sense, God is a disappointment, or God has abandoned us. I don't think he lied in a single line of that book, as to what he believes is true about God. But part of what we do in the book club is align that, right, with Catholic philosophy and really examine that, like how close to the mark did he get? And you can look at somebody, you can look at an author and you can see a lot of their wounds, like, and there's a lot of art I create, there's stuff I make and I look back at it 5 years later, a few years later, and think, that's what I thought was true about human beings and myself and God at the time. And there were a lot of wounds in my heart there that I was working through. Today, I'm in a different place, but at the time I wrote it, that was as true as I could possibly make something. So yeah, I'm no Flannery O'Connor, basically. So.
This is such a fun conversation, and I was thinking about Flannery O'Connor in her own time, because I think, wasn't Dorothy Day also basically the same time period? So
Late 40s, yeah.
But what would you say about a conversation that Dorothy Day and Flannery O'Connor would have? They go for lunch. How would they be?
Dorothy Day was a very different person.
Would you also say that she represents the Catholic imagination? So do we have two mega different iterations of the Catholic imagination?
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't something that's isolated. It's not in a time capsule in the 1940s either. This is even today. I have a dear friend who has left the church. And a lot of his argument is that the corporal works of mercy, you can be concerned about someone's soul all you want, but maybe they need to pay the rent, or they haven't eaten in a few days. And so it comes off as very pompous and tone deaf to be worried about their spiritual well-being when they physically are in poverty, and what are we doing about meeting those physical needs of people, the corporal works of mercy. And there's always this tension there, over what people really need and how to really love people. And Dorothy Day, every one of us is an example of an extreme. I really think God just paints with vivid colors. Like, we're all very, very extreme in our ways. And this is why there's so many of us. We put ourselves all together, and then we have this beautiful picture. But if we're individual human beings, we're all going to have like sharp biases in one direction. And that doesn't make it wrong, right? That means that it's incomplete. As one human being, you're incomplete. One person cannot embody the fullness of what it means to be a human being, of what God is creating, of what love looks like, and how to interact. It's just not possible. Now, if you put, it is not good for man to be alone, right? We get right back to Genesis. If you put Dorothy Day and Flannery O'Connor together, you get a lot closer to a balanced, complete human being. And that's just how creation appears to work. We're not supposed to look at it in isolation. But I would say they're both examples of beauty and truth and goodness, in their own ways, with their own extremes.
Because I guess I was wondering, I really liked your reading of feminism, and then she would have, her own parents would have gone through the suffrage movement. I don't know when she was born, but then she was a Catholic in the South, and then I think it's always interesting, people who live in ostensibly non-Catholic environments, what would she have said about lynching? What would she have said about civil war? What would she have said about separate but equal facilities? Is there anything like that?
She has said some conflicting things. I believe in one of her letters she said she is an integrationist by principle and a segregationist by personal preference. It's something that you could say were pretty ugly. But this was her wrestling with these things, right? Saying that she wants to be the kind of person who truly sees the humanity in every human being, who has no racial biases, and the reality of who she is, well, she was honest about that too. The reality was that she did harbor a lot of very racist beliefs. So that's true. I have a lot of grace and understanding for that because, oh my goodness, none of us are ideologically pure. That's there's always that wrestling, as the Lord is working on us. Regardless, she didn't stray from the ideal commitment, right? And a lot of what the Catholic philosophy is a commitment to that abstract ideal, no matter what. That this is the uncompromising standard of humanity, of human dignity, of what the human person is worth. And we aim for that. We have that guiding star to aim for, but we fall pretty short of that, right? And so I think if we were able to have some of those conversations, you'd probably find those very conflicted views for her. And you can see them in her work too. She's really like wrestling with what does she think about these things? Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you so much for a wonderful talk and wonderful conversation. If you want more conversations like this, please join the book club. It's free, and you will be supporting our Backpacks for Kids programs. We would really appreciate that. So thank you so much. You guys have a wonderful evening.